For decades, ever since the Iranian Revolution and the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979, and especially with the eruption of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Beijing has been selling arms to the Iranian regime. China helped Iran build its aggressive and advanced ballistic missile program. China also helped Iran go nuclear, building some of Tehran's earliest nuclear power plants, including the Isfahan Nuclear Research Center that trained some of Iran's first nuclear scientists. China helped Iran develop its uranium enrichment system, all of which has helped the regime in Tehran pursue nuclear weapons. At one point, the Pentagon declared China a principal supplier of nuclear technology to Iran. What's more, China has helped Iran develop its chemical weapons program, its biological weapons program. And combined with Iran's nuclear weapons program, these three pose grave and growing threats to Israel and the Jewish people. But that is just the beginning. Even after the Trump administration imposed crippling economic sanctions on Iran as part of its maximum pressure campaign to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons and to stop Iran from exporting terrorism all over the region and the world, Beijing has done everything it can to help Iran thwart those sanctions. Indeed, China currently buys about 90% of all the black market oil that Iran sells, putting tens of billions of dollars in Iran's coffers, all of which helped Iran fund Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. When Hamas invaded Israel on October 7, 2023, did China condemn the terror group? Not at all. Rather, China, Communist China, has bitterly condemned Israel and constantly demanded that Israel agree to a permanent ceasefire, that is, surrender, right, in Gaza. That's what China wants. They want Israel to surrender. Now, if this weren't enough, China is flooding social media with anti-Semitic propaganda. Take a look at this interesting quote. What we saw after October 7th was a drastic change in the social media within China. The anti-Semitism became much more unplugged, much more free-flowing. Now, who said that? The State Department's Deputy Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, Aaron Kayak, he spoke to a reporter not long ago. More of his quotes. And because we know that the Chinese internet is not free, that's a conscious decision by the Chinese government to allow that kind of rhetoric to be greatly increased. This is not some kind of uptick. This was a tsunami of anti-Semitic rhetoric that was allowed to spread on China's social media, Kayak said. This sort of drastic increase that has been sustained since October 7th coming out of China does not happen by accident. At the same time, China is driving pro-Hamas and anti-Israel content through its social media networks, as well as its state-run media and tech companies, all of which operate under strict instructions from Chinese government censors. Last year, 2 Chinese internet search engines actually erased Israel from their maps. All right, take a look at this quote. Right now, it is very dangerous to be pro-Israel inside China without suffering some kind of punishment. That is the environment. Those are the words of former State Department official Miles Yu, who was giving testimony last year to a select congressional committee on the Chinese Communist Party. More of his quote. The reason why China chose this moment to take a decisively anti-Israel position is because China regards Israel as a close ally of the West. Now look, all this would be bad enough, but it gets worse. Chinese weapons are either being sold directly to or being transferred to Israel's worst enemies, enemies like Hezbollah. How serious is the threat of communist China to Israel? Now, that may seem like a silly question because you think, well, the communist Chinese are focused on Taiwan, they're focused on the Pacific, but it's not as silly as you think. Hi, this is Joel Rosenberg. I'm here on an IDF, Israeli Defense Forces base in northern Israel, not far from the Lebanon border. And over the next few minutes, I want to walk you through 18,000 pieces of military hardware, weapons captured by the Israeli forces in southern Lebanon from Hezbollah. But let's start here. I'm on this base looking at all this hardware that's been captured, all this military hardware captured by Israel from Hezbollah. What you have here is a description of some of what we've got here. The QW-1 Chinese anti-aircraft rocket launcher. Now this is incredibly dangerous. And here's an actual, an example of one of these launchers, okay? Now just imagine this. It's portable, it's light. This is very lightweight. And what you do is you aim it at the sky, load it with a missile, and fire it at an Israeli aircraft. Now that could be a military aircraft, though obviously the military aircraft is going to fight back. But what's incredibly dangerous about this as well is it could shoot down Israeli civilian aircraft, or not just Israeli. What about civilian aircraft coming into Israel and land at Ben Gurion Airport? Now in the weeks and months ahead, I want to focus more on the threat from China. You know that I focus a lot on the threat from Iran, from Russia, from radical Islamism, whether it's Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. We're going to keep covering that because it's very serious and this war is not over. But being here today underscores something that I'm really concerned about, and that is the threat to Israel as well as to the United States, as well as to our Sunni Arab allies, the ones that have peace with Israel: Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, hopefully eventually Saudi Arabia. The threat posed to all of us, especially the United States and Israel, posed by Communist China. They are not, Communist China, Beijing is not just interested in invading Taiwan, they are. But they are working closely with the forces of radical Islamism. Why? To undermine and eventually disrupt and overthrow the Western security doctrine. But I'll tell you, the more I learn, the more I talk to senior Israeli officials, senior American officials, intelligence officials throughout the region, including Arab leaders, the threat that Communist China poses to Israel, the United States, and the peaceful Arab world is terrifying. China is investing money and weapons in our worst enemies. I deal with it fictionally in the Beijing betrayal, but this is evidence that it's not fiction. What I'm writing about in a novel form is actually very much real, and it could get worse if US, Israeli, and other regional and world leaders don't take the communist Chinese threat seriously. For almost a quarter of a century now, I've been writing novels and nonfiction books that warn of a range of worst-case scenarios. Scenarios that could blindside Western leaders and Western societies if we're not paying close attention and staying on our guard. With more than 5 million copies of these books in print, some of the most powerful leaders in the world are reading the books. Kings, crown princes, presidents, and prime ministers. As readers of my first political thriller, The Last Jihad, will recall, the first page of that first book that I ever wrote put you inside the cockpit of a hijacked jet, hijacked by radical Islamist terrorists coming in on a kamikaze attack mission into an American city. Then, as the narrative unfolded, my fictional American president declared war on Iraq and decided that he had to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Why? Because of Saddam's active support of terrorists in the Middle East and his historic use of chemical weapons against its own people, and Saddam's threat to scorch half of Israel, destroy and kill half of Israel with chemical weapons in the future. Now, I started writing that novel, The Last Jihad, in January of 2001. That was nearly 9 months before the horrifying events of September 11th. Then we know that another plane crashed into the Pentagon and blew up there and killed many. And then we know that a fourth plane that had been hijacked by these Al-Qaeda terrorists was heading to Washington to fly into the U.S. Capitol building. And yet, however, heroic passengers on that plane attacked the hijackers, tried to gain control of the plane. In the end, that plane went down in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Now, by the time that The Last Jihad was published, a year later, in November of 2002, President George W. Bush was preparing to go to war for real in Iraq, to remove Saddam Hussein from power for real because of his real financing of Middle East terrorists and his past and potential future use of weapons of mass destruction. That novel, my first, The Last Jihad, hit #1 on Amazon.com. It spent 11 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Why? Because it seemed prescient. Because even though it was fiction, it felt like it seemed to warn the world in advance of real-life threats that were coming up over the horizon. Now, my second novel was called The Last Days. It was about the last days of Yasser Arafat and how Hamas might rise to power and become incredibly dangerous in Gaza as a threat to Israel after Arafat dies. 13 months after The Last Days was published, Arafat was dead. Soon after, Hamas rose to power in Gaza and started to pose a threat to Israel, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, this is why U.S. News and World Report called me at that time a modern Nostradamus. Now, it's not true. I'm not Nostradamus. I'm not a psychic. I'm not a clairvoyant. I don't pretend to be a prophet, okay? Still, over the past quarter century or so, I've written about a wide range of potential other threats that did seem to come true or feel like they're going to come true soon. I've written about a Russian dictator threatening to invade Ukraine, all before it happened. I wrote about an ISIS group of terrorists taking over Syria before it happened. And I wrote about the Iranian regime trying to buy nuclear warheads from North Korea to attack Israel and the United States. That hasn't happened yet, thank God, but it feels like it could happen, right? Most recently, in my most recent novel, The Libyan Diversion, I wrote about Middle Eastern terrorists trying to infiltrate the United States via the southern border of Mexico. That is happening. But in The Libyan Diversion, I write about these terrorists trying to pull off a catastrophic mass casualty attack inside the United States. I won't tell you which city, you got to read the book, which is exponentially worse than 9/11. Thank God that one has not yet come to pass. Not yet. But I tell you, it's a scenario that I worry about every single day. People ask me all the time, Joel, what's wrong with you? Where do you get these ideas? Why do your novels seem so prescient? Why do you seem so able to predict the future in your books? Why do your books feel ripped from tomorrow's headlines? The answer is simple. Again, not a psychic, not a clairvoyant, not Nostradamus. The answer is simple. I study America's enemies. I study Israel's enemies. I read their books, I watch their speeches, and then, wait for it, I believe them. Too many politicians and intelligence analysts in the West dismiss the threats made by our worst enemies. They discount such threats, or they try to explain them away. But I read what these evil people say, I read what they write, I watch what they say, I study them, and I take them seriously. And then I ask, okay, what would it look like if our worst enemies actually tried to pull off their worst case scenarios, the threats, that their schemes, their evil schemes that they want so badly to execute? And then I write a novel about it. Why? To get people's attention, to get people to think. Yeah, I want to entertain people, but I want people to think. I want them to understand the threats that are coming, and I want leaders to act. One of the central and reoccurring themes in my books is this: to misunderstand the nature and threat of evil is to risk being blindsided by it. Let me say that again. To misunderstand the nature and threat of evil is to risk being blindsided by it. Let me give you a few examples. Didn't Adolf Hitler lay out his wicked genocidal plan in his book, Mein Kampf, for all the world to see? Yes. But American, British, and French leaders either didn't read the book or they didn't take Adolf Hitler seriously. And that's why they were blindsided by World War II and the Holocaust. Didn't Saddam Hussein actually literally tell the world in advance that he owned Kuwait, that Kuwait was all his, and that he was going to take it by force? Didn't he shout that from the rooftops in early 1990? Didn't he mass thousands of Iraqi troops on the borders of Kuwait in the summer of 1990? Of course. But Washington, London, and Paris and others did not take Saddam Hussein seriously. That's why they were blinded on August 2nd, 1990, when Saddam and his Iraqi troops invaded, raped, and pillaged Kuwait. Didn't Osama bin Laden openly and proudly declare war on the United States in the late 1990s? Didn't he attack 2 American embassies soon thereafter? Didn't he attack the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy warship, and threaten to do far worse? Yes. But American leaders simply did not believe that bin Laden could do anything worse than that. They could not imagine a scenario in which radical Islamist terrorists would hijack a jet plane, turn it into a missile, and fly on a kamikaze mission into an American city. I imagined it in my book all before it happened, but they, for whatever reason, they could not see it. They could not imagine it, and that's why they were blindsided on September 11th. At the core, the problem is this. Too many leaders and intelligence officials in the West do not believe that evil exists. Apparently, they think they're too smart, too educated, too sophisticated to believe that evil is real. So they ignore our worst enemies. Okay, not ignore, not exactly, but they don't take them seriously. They simply don't believe the evil schemes that our evil enemies insist that they're going to carry out. And thus, time after time, event after event, they're caught completely off guard when the next evil worst case scenario comes to pass. For the past 25 years or so, I've tried to take the opposite approach. Why? Because as an evangelical Christian who studies and believes the Bible, I have no doubt that evil exists. The Bible mentions the word evil 510 times. Okay? The Bible tells us a lot about evil is real, it exists, and people are driven by evil to do the very evil schemes that they shout from the rooftops. And that's why I carefully study what our enemies say, what they're going to do, why, and that's why I believe them. That's why I write novels to imagining them carrying out their evil schemes. Look, the Lord Jesus Christ himself said in John 10:10 that Satan, the thief, as he described him, comes to rob, kill, and destroy. We have to understand that's who Satan is, and when he drives a person to rob, kill, and destroy, it's because that's his nature. We have to understand that. And that's why in my next novel, The Beijing Betrayal, I've turned my attention to communist China. I've envisioned a scenario that could be the most dangerous and realistic of all the novels I've ever written. Now, in The Beijing Betrayal, communist China isn't simply preparing to invade Taiwan and destroy the entire American Navy in the Pacific, not just in the next few years or the next few months, but in the next few days. It's definitely, that's a big part of the scenario, but there's more. In the novel, China's leaders are also secretly funding radical Islamist terrorists in the Middle East who have a burning satanic hatred of Israel and our Sunni Arab allies and an imminent plan to kill millions of Americans with biological toxins produced in labs right here in the Middle East. Why have I written this novel? Because I believe that the regime in Beijing is evil.